My name is Amir Alibai. I'm from the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. And it gives me great pleasure, actually, to introduce our next two speakers, Creighton-Kelly and Trépanier. If you haven't had a chance, please look at their bios, because they've done incredible work over the last 30 years in the cultural sector. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing what they have to say about the state of things in 2018. So welcome.
Thank you, Amir. It is also an honor to be introduced by you. We haven't seen each other in a long time. Bonjour, mon nom est France Trépanier.
My name is France Trépanier. I know there's interpretation here. And since I'm French speaking, I thought I would say a few words in French, but je me
headphones, so I guess I'm going to speak English. That's okay. First, I would like to say how honored I am to be on the land here, to do a land acknowledgement. As an artist and curator of Ghanaian Kehaga and French ancestry, it is always a great honor to come here on this very, very powerful land. And this time I have the opportunity with my partner Chris to be here for a whole month for the Primary Couleurs project that we will tell you a little bit about. So thank you also, Shannon, and the programming committee for inviting us to speak to you today. And thank you, all of you, to be patient and to be sitting here at the end of Saturday afternoon and listening to us. So I am appreciative of that. So our talk is entitled Telling a Canadian Story. And I just want to mention that the artist here, this piece is called Manifest TP, and it's by the artist Caroline Monet. Who's also showing, I think some of you have had the opportunity to see some of her work here at the Banff Center. Just going to grab that.
Don't change it yet.
I also wanted to just mention how both of your talks, Jill and Jeff, have really resonated, and especially the one about how do we measure things. And I remember a conversation at the Canada Council many years ago where the director of research came to me and said, you know, we're collecting a lot of data, we're measuring a lot of stuff, we're doing a really good job at understanding who's attending what. But when it comes to Indigenous art, for some reason, we have no data. Is it because Indigenous people don't participate? Is it because they don't like to answer the questions? Is it because they're not producing work? And I took a minute to think about it, and I thought, I think the answer is like to be able to measure something, you have to understand what it is. And I proposed to the council to pause, and instead of trying to collect data on Indigenous art, to try to deepen the knowledge of what those practices look like, and what was their relationship to the communities and to the larger art system. So that's a bit what we will be talking about today.
Je m'appelle Creighton-Kelly.
My name is Creighton-Kelly.
I'm very happy and pleased to be here. Thank you for sticking around. I know some of you were kind of discomforted by the cabaret last night. And today, because you were discomforted, we're going to discomfort you a little bit more.
I will try.
I want to say that most of what we've experienced during the weekend has been looking at art practice from a certain kind of frame, from a certain kind of lens, and from certain kinds of traditions and histories. What we want to do is just shift that frame a little bit. And Jill's talk, which was about this notion of working with data and talking to patrons and trying to find out what patrons, it's a kind of conversation within a frame. And then Jeffrey took that frame and started pushing it and talking about other ways of evaluating, looking at different kind of audiences, looking how art serves different people. And now we're going to just push right out of the frame. And instead of looking at the frame from within the frame, we're going to look at the frame from outside the frame. In the large debate that's been going on internationally over the last 25 years between the democratization of culture, singular, and cultural democracy, we stand clearly on the cultural democracy side. And actually, we think of it as cultural democracies because we tend to pluralize our understanding. Now, I know that that complicates things. I know it takes 1.0 and 2.0 conversations up to 3.0. But this is what we have to do in Canada because we're all here now sharing the land, trying to live together. So we don't stress the idea of the artist as universal subject, read white. We stress artists, artists in collectivities, artists in communities. We don't talk about the arts community. We talk about communities. We pluralize and polyvocalize all of these words. We don't talk about arts audience. We talk about audiences because audiences are the citizens of this territory that we now call Canada. And certainly we don't talk about culture. We do not use the term Canadian culture. Occasionally we might talk about Canadian cultures, but even that is kind of antithetical to how Indigenous people see their practices. They're not Canadians. In the 1960s, Susan Crean wrote a book, which many of you are familiar with, called Who's Afraid of Canadian Culture? It was a landmark book, and it's helped to shape the notion that somehow Canada was different from its parents, the UK and France, and its overbearing step-parent to the south, the United States. And it was all about Canadian cultural and economic nationalism. We ask, Primary Colours asks, who's afraid of Canadian cultures?
And just a quick note before we move to the next slide. You know, when we talk about metrics of how we measure the impact, you know, in many Indigenous communities right now as we speak here and be together in this room, the measure that is used is how many suicide will be prevented in a given community. That's the reality of here now, right? So, Primary Colours. It's a 3-year initiative. It's a project that we have been embarked on together. Chris and I have been doing this kind of work, equity work, advocacy work, artistic curatorial work for many, many years. Actually, we met at the Canada Council in a previous incarnation, and we've been partners for a long time in life and in work. And this project has as its main objective to place Indigenous art practices at the center of the Canadian art system. Now, I know it sounds pretty bold, but it is, and it is ambitious, and I believe profoundly that this is what we need to do in this country in the context of reconciliation, but also in the context of a country that is really shifting. The project also asserts that the art practices by people of color play a critical role in imagining Canada's future. And again, Jeff, you were referring to the wealth of knowledge, the bodies of knowledge, the wealth of cultures and art practices that exist in this country that we have to bring to the fore for the future generations.
And one last word about Indigenous cultures and why I think it's everybody's responsibility in this room, not just Indigenous people. If Kathak dancing dies in Canada tomorrow, it'll carry on the South Asian continent. If taiko drumming dies, it'll continue in Japan. If European opera dies, it will continue. But if the practices of Indigenous people die on this territory, they're dead. It's over.
This is the homeland. And so we have a collective responsibility to make sure that we nurture and we develop and sustain those practices, not just for Indigenous people, for all of us who live here on this land and the ones to come. A quick word on methodologies. In our approach for this 3-year project, we have really tried to step away from more Western ways of relating to knowledge and to relating to each other. So we have developed protocols that are inspired by Indigenous cultures, Indigenous practices, and for the project we are also working deeply in partnership with local communities, Indigenous communities, in developing these protocols. So notions of welcoming, of acknowledging of land, notions of witnesses, the role of witnesses in a cultural project, the question of polyvocality, so decentering the authority of the expert, the way that we talk to each other where there's no panel, no keynotes, no experts.
And also the question of polyvocality comes into the matter of how we report and relate to funding agencies. We don't write reports. We don't have the authorship or the totalitarian vision to say this is an event with 135 artists and we know what happened and what are your criteria, check, 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 check. The way we report is we ask the people who came and we commission them to write short essays. So you get conflicting, contradictory kind of impressions of what happened, and we hand that in collectively as a report. So part of our goal is not just to change how we work together in the protocols that we work with, but to change the protocol and change the funder-client relationship that all of us pretty much dislike. No more of this. No more of the funders dictating to us how we report or what we do. We don't use panels, as France just said. We don't use keynotes, and we don't use experts. The reason we don't use experts because when we curate people to come together, we believe each one of those people are experts. Each one of their voices contain knowledge. And the issue is to find ways, methodologies, to generate that knowledge so that it comes out, and then it's in a collective space, and then we deal with it. So often we hold events like the residency we're doing now, where we don't have any formal agenda or formal schedule. And we allow it to be generated by the people who are there, and suddenly an empty schedule is filled up in 48 hours. Now, when we first got here, we had lots of time. Now we're going to the end of next week, and we don't have enough time to discuss everything we want to. And we also use the strategies of what we call planned improvisation, which basically means that we're spontaneously changing and developing a project as it goes. The project is open to the input of the people who are participating in it, and France will talk a little bit more about that aspect of relevance in the 5 Rs.
The 5 Rs is actually their principles that are not specifically Indigenous, but certainly that are guiding Indigenous research and methods of developing projects. They have been elaborated by a number of Indigenous scholars, namely Linda Tihawi Smith and Sean Wilson. Linda, who's Maori from New Zealand, and Sean, who lives in Australia, but he's Cree from northern Manitoba. And these 5 Rs are really guiding principles for any project. They were developed mainly for research, but we've been applying them in the arts for many, many years. And I find it personally a very, very potent guide for any project that I have, that I want to develop. So the first question that I ask myself is, where do I place respect in that project? Am I being respectful in developing my idea? Am I being responsible in developing this idea? Am I being responsible in the way that I'm engaging my audience or the way I'm engaging a community that I want to work with? I also ask myself, the idea that I'm putting forth, is it relevant to them? It's relevant to me because, it's my idea. So, of course it's relevant to me. But is it relevant to other people around me? Is it relevant to my collaborators? Is it relevant to the First Nations people that I'm trying to bring into my project? And then the question of relationality, and we'll come back to that. The importance of building relations. So it's really, and we've alluded to that a few times during the weekend. It's the relational versus the transactional. So am I building relationship in the work that I'm doing? And not just selling tickets. This is not just bums and seats. These are people, right? So I'm relating to them as people, and not just to short-term gain of having them sit in my theater or in my gallery, but to have this continuing relationship. And finally, a very, very important one is the notion of reciprocity. I'm gaining something, I'm offering something, and it's especially in collaborations. We go in communities, and for Indigenous communities in Canada, this has been a real problem, where you've got people, well-meaning people, very well-meaning people, with really good ideas sometimes, that go in community, that bring along a bunch of people. They do their project, they're enthusiastic, it worked well. They were able to tick the box. They were able to pat themselves on the back. And then they leave. And then the community stays there. So what is it that you're bringing to that community? If you don't go there and take some knowledge, if you're going to work with elders, if you're going to work with knowledge keepers, what is it that you're leaving in that community afterwards. We've been talking a lot this weekend also about the need to change. The system is changing. The council this morning was talking about the changes at council and how the country is changing and how we need to change as well. And my mentors, my elders have taught me that to understand where we're going, it is really important to understand where we're coming from. And I think sometimes in Canada, our collective history as an art system is not well explained or well known. We have this idea when we teach art history that art has started in this country with the arrival of the Europeans. But in fact, there was 15,000 years of art practices, of cultural practices, of language practices in this country. And because it was not written, because those cultures were oral in nature, they've been kind of pushed to the margin. I'm sure, I mean, you know, just go back to your history book in school, History of Canada, where you have probably a page, if you're lucky, a page and a half of Aboriginal presence, and then we shift with Europeans. And then the story starts, right? So I just wanted to share with you these words from Doreen Jensen, who's a Gixtan elder and artist, where she kind of reminds us of what existed before the arrival of the Europeans. Because there was something here, right? And the tragedy is that I think the newcomers didn't see that or didn't understand the importance of that, of those cultures and those art practices. And actually they didn't understand either the definition of what art was for those communities, those nations, the very definition of what art is. And this is part of the legacy that we're dealing with today.
Read the quote?
No, I don't think
Okay.
I'm going to read it.
Okay.
You read it, right? Can you see in the back? Good.
And upon that history, which Ross just talked about 500 years in about 3 minutes, it brings us to the current development of the art system that we have in place now, which, as we all know, began in the 1950s with the Massey-Levesque Commission, at the same time that knowledge extraction, residential schools, all of the history of Indigenous people was coming to a certain point. Francois always talks about this coincidence between the Massey-Levesque Commission in 1949, 50, and 51, and in 1950, the final end of the ban on cultural practices, Indigenous cultural practices. And in the Massey-Levesque Commission, now remember, these people were the progressive people who were trying to create a professional art system in Canada and herald in the cultural nation-building period, the period, you know, roughly from 1950 to 1985. They wrote this in the report. There were 2 paragraphs about Indigenous practices, and I am going to read this quote. It says, "This unsatisfactory state of affairs has led some to believe that, since the death of true Indian arts is inevitable, Indians should not be encouraged to prolong the existence of arts which at best must be artificial and at worst are degenerate. The impact of the white man with his more advanced civilization and his infinitely superior techniques has resulted in the gradual destruction of the Indian way of life." Well, they got one thing right anyway. "The Indian arts thus survive only as ghosts or shadows of a dead society. They can never, it is said," the favorite line of politicians, "it is said," "regain real form or substance. Indians with creative talent should therefore develop it, as other Canadians do, and should receive every encouragement for this purpose, but Indian art as such cannot be revived." Now, why do I throw this quote out that's almost 70 years old? Not to say that it's alive necessarily today or that we all think this way today, but to point out that our entire cultural building period And the cultural and the art system that we have today is built upon these kind of premises. It can't be denied. There's a reason why, even after what the council presented this morning, 85 to 90% of money is still going to European art forms.
And I think we talk about this history not to make people feel bad, but to understand that this is the foundation of our art system. Because at the same time that Indigenous art practices were completely banned, until 1951, the Indian Act banned cultural practices, banned potlatches, and perpetrated cultural genocide in this country. So this is our legacy. This is like the building blocks that we're trying to work on together, and we're trying to imagine a future. So if we don't understand how this has permeated the system, we're going to have a hard time fixing it, right? I always say to my students, if you want to change something, you have to understand what it is. So what is it? What is our system? It's a system.
We have to go speed up here a bit.
Yeah, okay. It's a system where the indigenous practices, the practices of this land, were completely pushed to the side. Actually, they were devalued. They were not art forms anymore. They became artifacts or they became craft. And Europeans arrived with their art forms. And our system is we're still in the legacy of that.
So then looking at these last 70 years and how the history we've come through, that many of the organizations in this room have lived through. If we say that the period, these are rough dates, of course, it didn't happen overnight, where white settlers began to take over the territory we now call Canada. Obviously, they arrived 500 years ago plus, but it was around 1700 with the development of the Cabinet de Curiosité, the whole museum system, the thieving of artifacts, and the creation of the mythology of the dying race paradigm. The dying race paradigm says, you people are amazing, you're authentic, but you're dying out. We have to take your objects and take them from you. And that period kind of ended. And so the whole premise of Indigenous art practices up until about 1950 was basically to exclude them from any kind of understanding of what would be fine art or how we define high art or those kind of definitions which are basically not used anymore today. Then from 1950 to 1980, there was a period of more or less indifference. It was the period after the quote that I just showed you, which goes something like this. Okay, whatever it is you're doing over there, I don't know, we don't care, but we don't really want to talk about it. There are some notable exceptions. 1967 at Expo, the Indian Pavilion, a very important moment in Canadian history. No time to get into it here. Then in around 1980 or so, mid-80s, communities of color and Indigenous communities started saying, okay, look, you can't have all of the money. We're here too. So give us access. Access basically meant whatever crumbs you feel like dropping from the table, we'll take it. And it also basically meant whatever the criteria are for getting funding, we'll adapt. We'll do whatever we need to do to get, $5,000 or whatever people wanted. That went on for about 15 years till the mid-90s, where organizations of color started to develop. Indigenous artists started saying, what are we having access to? What's going on here? We have not enough money to do anything really, and a lot of organizations failed in the mid-90s. And so the funding system, the arts organizations developed this rhetoric of inclusion. I've still heard it here all over the weekend. If you think about the word inclusion just for a minute from an Indigenous perspective, it's kind of insulting. And if France can do it really, really quick, I'll ask her to talk about the metaphor you use of the house.
Well, actually, it's Elder Sykes, too, the other day that was using the same metaphor. I mean, if you put it from an Indigenous perspective, it's like you're inhabiting this beautiful house, right? Big house, 2-story, 3-story, double garage, you've got it all, the pool in the back. And you're really enjoying life. Life is good. And then somebody knocks at your door, and actually they knock, but they just open the door and they barge in. And they actually come with all their families and their friends and their neighbors, and they kind of invade your house. And they kind of put you in the downstairs basement bedroom, and they tell you cannot get out of there. And actually you need a pass. If you need to get out of that room, you're going to need a pass. And they occupy your room, right, for many, many years. And then one day, out of the greatness of their hearts, they come and knock on your door and say, hey, you know what? Come out. We're going to include you. We're going to have you for dinner one time. Can you see how this doesn't make sense from an Indigenous perspective?
And the morning after, you say, well, we invited them, but they didn't come. So now you've done your Indigenous outreach, it's over. They didn't come. So this period lasted till a few years ago. We just arbitrarily kind of divided into 15 years, but it's been growing and growing and growing. And the inclusion paradigm is basically thrown out by Indigenous people and then by communities of color. So where we are now, in the period we're living in right now, is an engagement period. It's a real engagement period where that's what we're doing here today. We're here to tell you, as our friends from Primary College Residency are, that we're engaging. We're engaging the institutions the way they are with their Eurocentric notions, and we have basically the agenda that France described, to try to change this system.
And I think the councils are trying to do
yeah,
that as well.
So, and many other institutions too, not just the council. But the point is that that's our agenda, and we're not hiding that or being shy about it, and we're not ashamed of it. We're just saying it directly. That's what we want to do. And if we can get through this engagement period to 2025, something like that, forward, we're looking at self-determination. And that's particularly important to Indigenous people. We cannot just keep throwing the rhetoric of reconciliation, nation to nation, all this stuff that we hear from our governments and our politicians, and then when push comes to shove, it means nothing. This is particularly true when we talk about funding agencies, Canadian Heritage, the provincial arts councils, who are trying to do reconciliation and not understanding that the engagement means the people who are coming from communities have to change to understand that, but the institutions have to change. It's a change when Willie Ehrman talks about engagement as the ethical space of engagement. It's an ethical space that has to be created by both sides.
It's just redefining how we're going to inhabit the house together. And who's going to get access to that kitchen, and who's going to get into the pool and the double garage. Like, who's going to get what, and how can we share? Because, see, the thing is, like, we're all here to stay, right? We're not going anywhere, and I think you guys are we're all here to stay. Plus, we have new people coming all the time, which is fantastic. So we have to figure this out for us, but especially for the next generation.
And you have to figure it out in the next 5 minutes.
Okay, go.
So
how do we do that?
We've heard a lot of talk on the weekend about, how do we reach this audience, or how many people of color do we need to hire before we can tick the boxes, or how can we develop new audiences. There was quite a lot of talk about new audiences this weekend. What we are talking about is not one box here and one box here. We're talking about doing all these nodes together and more than this. These are just examples. I'm going to whip through them. We're going to whip through them really quickly because we're running out of time. You can't fix it by doing any one thing. You have to fix it by doing all of them. So the first thing is you have to hire racialized people, Indigenous people, people of color. Bring them in your institution. Not one token, not one on the board, not 3. Bring them in. Hire them. Get those bodies in your spaces.
You'll see it's going to really help. The second was methodology for developing work. There's many ways of developing work, and there's rich traditions around us. So I think welcoming, challenging yourselves in terms of how are you developing work? How are you engaging other ways, other bodies of knowledge? And how is that informing your work? There are 2 beautiful surprises to come.
If you have a rehearsal space and you're bringing a group of people together to work on a piece, how are you welcoming them? How is that space created for some kind of engagement instead of just following protocols that have existed from the European traditions? Obviously, you have to change your programming. So it's not just the methodology of how you do work, it's what's on the walls, what's on the stages. People talk about that, but that by itself is not enough. Just programming is not enough.
And then the new audiences. I think you're all very concerned about new audiences. Well, obviously, by changing who's in your organization, what you're programming, how you program it will just attract new audiences. And I think there were brilliant examples that were mentioned here in the past weekend.
Engagement, community engagement. What do we mean by community engagement? We don't just mean, we got to work with such and such a community, and we have to work with them for 3 months. Got to develop that progress. Get that up there, get that show done. Okay, thank you very much. It's an ongoing relationship. And instead of the term outreach, we prefer the term inreach. It's a term that we borrow from Diane Roberts, who's an African-Canadian theater artist, and she talks about doing work. Instead of saying, we invited them and they didn't come, go to where people are. Go into their community centers. Go on reserve. Go into mosques. Go into places where people are. Community centers, cafes. Find out. It's going to change you if you do this, rather than just imagining an audience and saying, well, how do we get them? Well, let's take an ad out in the ethnic press. Go and talk to people. Use elders. Use InReach. Use community advisors.
How many of you have been on reserve?
Woo! Woo!
Woo! Beautiful. Shifting
You
landscape.
didn't talk about the ongoing relationship. That's super important.
Nurturing ongoing relationship. Yes. Yes, thank you. The importance, it goes back to one of the R's, that is relationality. You just don't go and talk to people when you need them, but you talk to them before and during and after, and you keep nurturing that. So even if your festival is only 3 days in the year, you don't just approach those communities for the week before, the month before, and then don't talk to them for the rest of the year. Keep visiting. Think of it as visiting. Go and have tea. Then the shifting landscape. We wanted to briefly look at what's happening. There's trends, obviously, and from an Indigenous perspective, the 94 calls to action from the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think have really shifted something in the body politics of this country. And it is having an impact. We're still trying to figure it out, but I think this is a really, really important current that we're seeing, witnessing.
And Simone Carolyn talked about this morning, about how the whole shift is happening in society, in civic society, and it has to happen in the arts world. Why is the art world always catching up? We're the people with imagination. We're the artists. We're supposed to be the people that understand the future, that we can imagine the future. Let's not catch up to the military and the banks. Let's get out there where we should be. The second part of the shifting landscape is demographics. We canceled those slides because we didn't have enough time, but I'll do my slides with my hands. There's 3 demographics that are happening in this country right now. One is the Aboriginal birth rate, and it's going like this.
It's the ultimate revenge. We're getting the country back. One kid at a time.
The Aboriginal birth rate is double the birth rate of all other Canadians. So that is creating a lot of young Indigenous people. Most Indigenous people are under 25 years old. That's a huge pent-up demand for creative expression, for cultural expression, and for arts funding. The second demographic is, as we all know, the immigration demographic. It's going like this.
And the birth rate of people of color, right?
No, not so much. The immigrants to Canada that are coming are increasing all the time, something like 250,000 people a year. Most of those people are coming from countries of color, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and that's what Canada is changing. If you look at the demographics, you realize that possibly something very close now to 1 out of 3 people in this country is either an Indigenous person or a person of color. It's like over 30% now. And statistics are always a couple years old, so I'd say it's 1 out of 3 right now.
The third element is the question of indigeneity in mainstream arts organization. We've seen in the past 4 or 5 years an increased presence of Indigenous bodies, artists, in mainstream arts organization. And this is something to be celebrated, but it's also something to be careful about. I think we are seeing perverse effect of this, where people are put in very precarious positions, where people are hired, but they are hired as interns. We see a lot of internships. We see a lot of fellowships. We see a lot of contractual work. I have this image of, we're invited in these organizations, but we're always sitting at the kids' table. We're never at the big people table. And yet these Indigenous bodies are asked to do their job as curators, as artistic directors, but they also become the equity coordinator. They become the sensibility, training people, the outreach people. They become all of these jobs. So I think in your organization, if you bring people of color and Indigenous people, you have to really make sure that you're creating spaces where they can succeed, and spaces where power is shared and agency is available to them so that they can do their job properly and not burn out.
We're going to leave the last slide off. Okay. I won't repeat the CCA's funding model. They did a good job today. Just enough to say that usually in our history, the way the Canada Council goes, the rest of the country goes. And we talk a lot with provincial arts councils and arts funding bodies, and they're trying to understand what the council's doing. Now, I know there's not lots of problems with the council's model. We tend to conceptualize it that the council decided to just change everything by throwing everything up in the air. And it's kind of been chaotic for many of us the last year, and probably will for another year. But what's happening is the various pieces are hitting the ground. And slowly something comprehensive and cohesive and understandable is emerging. And that's good for, it's the biggest change in the council's history.
And then the other big current that is shifting our landscape is the digital presence in the arts. And I think we've been talking about that quite a bit here. The possibilities for remote communities, the possibilities for communities that have been traditionally marginalized, I think this opens doors and we can just dream of really, really exciting stuff. Challenging, but exciting.
And as was discussed on Sarah's panel and then again today, this idea that the digital presence is not an analog presence. It's not a presence of how do I take my work and put it online so I can be more successful to market my work. It's changing everything about how we understand the arts system, the arts environment, the experience of art practice, and Jeffrey alluded to that as well. So what we see if we put all these shifting landscape elements together is an entire new emerging art system. It's an art system by which you ask the question, what is art? And you got a different answer than you would have had 30 or 300 years ago. What is an artist? What does an art system look like? There was a time when I first started in the arts, if you told somebody, as I did, hey, I'm a video artist, it sounded super avant-garde. I'm a video artist, man. I carry a camera with me. It weighs about 3 tons, but anyway, it's portable, and I shoot things, and then I show this stuff in galleries. That was what a video artist was. If you say today you're a video artist, you might as well say you're a weaver, because it's such a quaint notion in the past when every third YouTuber considers herself as some kind of a video artist. So all of these definitions that we take for granted are changing very, very quickly. Go.
So as a way of bringing all of that together, we just put a few slides here where to illustrate visually the progression, the development of the art system in Canada. So this is kind of what it looked like in the 1950s. Pretty white. And with just a few dots of color around. One little Indigenous dot there, that red dot.
Show, don't tell.
And then in the 1975, again, pretty white center, but a little more dots of colors. And then 2000, things are really starting to shift. And the hope is that we're going to put indigeneity at the center of our system, and there's going to be space for everybody to stay in that house and have fun together. But we'll put the Indigenous practices in the middle.
So, to end it all and to let it go, you're going right there?
Oh, okay. You want this one?
Yeah.
Sorry.
We just want to talk about how Primary Colors imagines we can get there. We start by moving beyond race hatred. I'm pretty sure that in this room, we're beyond that. Is anybody a racist here? Just checking. Just checking. Okay, no, we're good. Okay, we're good on that one. The second one is the denial that there's actually a problem. Does anyone think there's a problem in the Canadian art system? Oh, about half the room. Okay, so we're still dealing with that. Okay, number 3 is guilt. The feeling of, okay, yeah, something got messed up along the way there, but I'm kind of paralyzed by it because I don't know what to do with it. We have to move beyond that. 4 is tolerance. We certainly need to move beyond tolerance. Tolerance is a word from the multicultural lingo of the 1970s, and I don't want to live in a country where we tolerate one another. I don't want to be tolerated, and I don't want to tolerate other people. I want to know, engage, and understand other people. We have to get beyond the idea of inclusion. As France said, I won't repeat what she said because we're running out of time. And finally, we have to get beyond this idea of sacrifice, that we're doing something really amazing and we deserve pats on the back. And we get cultural capital from helping Indigenous people. We have to be able to do this as a matter of course, as a matter of social justice, and a matter of imagining a different future. So we want to say to you, join us in this. What have you got to lose? Except your power. Thank you.